The Harrington estate sat at the end of Magnolia Drive like a crown jewel set into the hills of Connecticut, its white marble facade catching the morning light in ways that made it look like something out of a dream. 42 rooms, 7 bathrooms, a wine cellar that cost more to maintain annually than most American families earned in 3 years. And within its polished, echoing halls, the kind of silence that only extreme wealth could purchase, the silence of people pretending that certain other people simply did not exist. Clara Mendez had learned that particular silence well. In the 14 months she had worked as a live-in maid for the Harrington household, she had perfected the art of invisibility. Move quietly. Keep your eyes down. Dust the shelves without disturbing the feng shui. Replace the flowers before they wilted because Mr. Harrington, Ethan Harrington, 33 years old and the youngest self-made billionaire in the northeastern United States, noticed dead flowers the way most people noticed a missing limb. He had built an empire from nothing, they said. Started with a single tech patent at 22, sold it for $40 million, then built 3 more companies on top of that. He had the eyes of a man who saw everything, calculated everything, and wasted nothing. Except he had never once looked directly at Clara. She was fine with that. She told herself she was fine with that every single morning when she woke at 5:30, splashed cold water on her face in the staff bathroom, and began her rounds before the household stirred. She was fine with it when she folded his shirts with military precision and left them in drawers he opened without gratitude. She was fine with it when she overheard him on conference calls in his study, his voice low and commanding and achingly human in a way that reminded her that powerful men were still, underneath it all, just men. What she was not fine with, could never be fully fine with, was leaving her daughter, Rosie, 3 years old, and the entire circumference of Clara's universe. Rosie with her wild black curls and her gap-toothed smile and the way she said, "Mama," like it was the most important word in any language, which, as far as Clara was concerned, it absolutely was. Rosie stayed in the small staff cottage at the back of the property during Clara's working hours, watched over by Mrs. Patton, the elderly housekeeper who had worked for the Harrington family for 20 years and who had taken one look at Clara's situation 18 months ago, single mother, fleeing a bad marriage, desperate for work that included housing, and had quietly advocated for her hire. "He'll never notice she's here," Mrs. Patton had promised, referring to Rosie. "And even if he does, Mr. Harrington isn't the monster the tabloids make him out to be." Clara had been grateful. She was still grateful. But gratitude was an exhausting emotion to carry full-time, and some mornings, when Rosie clung to her legs and cried because she wanted her mama to stay, Clara cried in the staff bathroom afterward and told herself it was allergies. Today was a Thursday in late October, and the estate was buzzing with attention Clara recognized immediately upon arrival at the main house. Extra flower arrangements had been ordered. She had arranged them herself. White orchids and pale roses, nothing too extravagant, but clearly designed to impress. The formal dining room had been set for 2. The kitchen staff had been given a specific menu: pan-seared duck, truffle risotto, a dessert flown in from a patisserie in Manhattan. Someone important was coming to dinner. His fiancée, whispered Danny, the youngest of the kitchen staff, with the barely concealed excitement of someone who had been waiting for exactly this piece of gossip. Vivian Cole, the heiress. They've been engaged for 4 months, but she's barely been here. People say she doesn't like the estate. Too far from the city. Clara nodded and said nothing, because saying nothing was part of the job. She had seen photographs of Vivian Cole in the society pages that sometimes sat on the hallway table, a tall, severe woman with cheekbones like sculpture and an expression permanently set to mild disdain. The kind of woman who looked at the world like it owed her something and was perpetually disappointed by the repayment plan. She went about her work with extra care that afternoon, knowing that every surface, Every fold, every detail would be subject to a scrutiny she didn't normally face. She was on her hands and knees in the formal sitting room, polishing the legs of an antique coffee table, when she heard the front door open at 4:30, earlier than expected. Vivian Cole's voice entered a room before the rest of her did. God, Ethan, it smells like cleaning products in here. Can't they use something that doesn't announce itself quite so aggressively? Clara stilled. She was behind the sofa, mostly hidden, her polishing cloth frozen in her hand. Ethan's voice followed, measured, a little tired. It's a clean house, Vivian. That's what it's supposed to smell like. It smells like staff. A pause. Clara's jaw tightened. She had heard variations of this sentiment before in previous houses, in previous lives. It never got easier. It just got more familiar, the way a scar you've had long enough stops hurting but never quite disappears. She gathered her supplies carefully and began to rise, intending to slip out through the side hallway before she was noticed. She had almost made it to her feet when the sitting room door opened wider and footsteps clicked across the hardwood, expensive heels, precise and deliberate, and Vivian Cole stepped fully into the room. Their eyes met. Vivian's gaze moved over Clara the way you might glance at a piece of furniture, assessing, briefly, whether it was in the right place. Then something shifted in her expression. Not warmth. Something closer to opportunity. You, she said, the word carrying more weight than its single syllable deserved. I've been meaning to say something about the East Wing bathroom. The grout near the shower. It's not acceptable. I don't know what standard you've been holding yourself to, but I expect better. I expect significantly better. Clara opened her mouth, closed it, breathed. She had learned, in 14 months, that the correct response was a quiet yes, ma'am, and slight incline of the head. She had learned that dignity was sometimes a private thing, something you kept tucked inside your chest where no one could touch it. She had learned to choose her battles and her silences with equal care. She was about to choose silence again when the sitting room door opened a second time and something small and breathless and completely unstoppable came charging through it. Rosie, 3 years old and unaware of class systems, dress codes, social hierarchies, or the very particular danger of the moment she had just wandered into. She had escaped Mrs. Patton somehow. This happened occasionally, with the inevitability of weather, and now she stood in the doorway of the formal sitting room in her tiny corduroy overalls, clutching a battered stuffed elephant named Gerald, with oak leaves stuck in her curls from playing outside. She looked at Vivian. She looked at Ethan. Then she looked at her mother, and saw something in Clara's face that, with the instinctive emotional radar of a child who had spent 3 years learning to read her mother's moods, told her that something was wrong. Without a word, without a moment's hesitation, Rosie crossed the room in 6 running steps and planted herself directly in front of Clara, facing Vivian Cole with her small arms spread wide. A 3-year-old, standing guard. And in that moment, the entire room went completely, utterly still. The silence that fell over the sitting room was the kind that is texture. You could almost reach out and touch it. Vivian Cole stood perfectly still, her expression cycling through surprise, irritation, and something that might, in a more generous person, have landed on amusement. In her, it landed somewhere colder. Ethan Harrington stood in the doorway behind her, and he had gone very still in a different way. Not the stillness of affront. The stillness of a man who had just witnessed something that short-circuited his usual processing speed. Rosie had not moved. Her small arms were still spread wide, her stuffed elephant dangling from one fist, her chin lifted at an angle that was remarkable for someone who barely cleared 3 feet tall. She was staring at Vivian with enormous dark eyes, her mother's eyes, and her expression was one of pure, uncomplicated, ferocious protectiveness. Clara felt the breath leave her body. "Rosie," she whispered, her voice barely sound. "Baby, come here."
No.
Rosie said it with complete finality, not looking back. She kept her eyes on Vivian. "You were mean to my mama." The words dropped into the room like stones into still water, sending ripples that reached every corner. Vivian's perfectly shaped eyebrows rose precisely 1 centimeter. "Excuse me? You were mean to my mama," Rosie repeated, louder this time, in case the first statement hadn't been sufficiently clear. "You made her feel bad. I saw her face." She gripped Gerald tighter. "You're not supposed to make people feel bad." Clara's hands were shaking. She reached down and gently caught Rosie's shoulders, preparing to scoop her up and apologize profusely and probably begin drafting her own resignation letter in her head simultaneously, because this was it, this was the moment. This was how 14 months of careful invisibility ended, when Vivian spoke. "Control your child," she said, the words precise and quiet, and aimed at Clara like something sharp. "And perhaps reconsider whether live-in arrangements are appropriate when you clearly cannot manage." Vivian. One word. Ethan's voice. And something in the way he said it made Vivian stop mid-sentence. Clara looked up. Ethan had moved into the room without her noticing, and he was standing closer than she expected, and he was looking at Rosie. Really looking, the way those sharp, calculating eyes of his actually focused when something had genuinely caught his attention. Then he did something that Clara did not expect in any version of how she had imagined this moment ending. He crouched down. Ethan Harrington, 33 years old, worth approximately $4.7 billion, a man who conducted board meetings from custom-built conference rooms and negotiated contracts in Tokyo and Paris and Dubai, folded himself down to his knees on the antique Aubusson carpet so that he was eye level with a 3-year-old in corduroy overalls. "Hey," he said. His voice was different at this register. Quieter. Stripped of the boardroom architecture that usually framed it. Rosie studied him with the careful assessment children apply to strangers before deciding whether they qualify as safe. She did not lower her arms. "What's your elephant's name?" Ethan asked.
A pause.
"Gerald." "Gerald's a good name." A beat. "Is Gerald brave too? Or is that mostly you?" Rosie considered this seriously. "Gerald is brave sometimes. Mostly at night. I'm brave in the daytime." "That's a good system," Ethan said. "Covering all the hours." The tiniest softening occurred around Rosie's mouth. Not a smile yet, but the precursor to one. Clara was watching this exchange with the feeling of someone who has stepped off a curb expecting solid ground and found themselves suspended in midair, waiting to discover whether gravity still applied. "What's your name?" Ethan asked. "Rosie Mendez." She said it with the complete confidence of someone who had been taught that her name was important. "I'm Ethan." Rosie looked him over. "Do you live here?" "I do." "It's a very big house," she said, with the tone of someone lodging a reasonable observation. "It is," he agreed. "Too big, probably." Something shifted in the room then, some invisible redistribution of weight. Vivian had not moved, but her silence had changed quality, gone from imperious to something more uncertain. She was watching Ethan with an expression Clara couldn't fully read from her angle, but which contained elements of irritation and confusion in roughly equal measure. Ethan looked up from Rosie's face and found Clara's eyes for what she realized, with a startling lurch, was possibly the first time in 14 months. Really found them. Not the polite, passing, employer-to-employee visual acknowledgement. Found them. "How long has she been staying in the cottage?" he asked. Clara's throat tightened. 14 months, sir. Since I was hired. Mrs. Patton arranged. I can explain if there's been a problem." "There's no problem." He said it quietly but clearly. Then he stood, unhurriedly, and turned to face Vivian with an expression that Clara had never seen on him before. Not in board meeting footage she'd accidentally glimpsed on the study television, not in the rare moments she'd caught him off guard in the kitchen reaching for coffee. It was the expression of a man arriving at a decision he had perhaps been circling for longer than he'd admitted to himself. "We should talk," he said to Vivian. In the study. "We certainly should," Vivian said, and her voice had sharpened to something with clear edges. She turned on her heel and walked out, heels striking the hardwood in a rhythm that communicated displeasure with every step. Ethan lingered for a fraction of a second. He looked down at Rosie once more. "Good job," he said quietly. "Taking care of your mama." Rosie, who had finally lowered her arms, looked up at him with those enormous dark eyes and said, with the casual authority of someone stating an obvious truth, "That's what you're supposed to do." He held her gaze for a moment. Something crossed his face, complicated and private and gone quickly, like weather passing over landscape that looked unchanged afterward but wasn't. Then he followed Vivian down the hall. Clara stood in the wreckage of the moment, her heart hammering, one hand resting on her daughter's shoulder. She didn't know what had just happened. She didn't know what was being said in that study. She didn't know if she was about to be dismissed or defended or simply forgotten again in the shuffle of rich people's drama. But she knew this. Her daughter had stood in front of her with her arms spread wide, and a man who had never truly looked at her before had finally, actually seen her. She pulled Rosie against her and held her tight, pressing her lips to those wild curls that smelled like oak leaves and afternoon air, and breathed. "You can't do things like that, baby," she whispered. "You are sad," Rosie said simply, her voice muffled against Clara's shoulder. "I know. So I helped." Clara closed her eyes. "Yeah," she managed. "You did." In the study at the end of the hall, behind a closed mahogany door, something else was beginning, or perhaps ending. Clara pressed her daughter closer and waited for whatever came next. Ethan closed the study door and stood with his back against it for a moment, which was unusual. He was not a man who needed closed doors for composure. He had fired executives in glass-walled conference rooms without blinking. He had walked out of a negotiation in Singapore that would have netted him $200 million because something in the terms felt wrong, and he'd been right, and he never second-guessed it. He made decisions the way other people breathed, continuously, automatically, without visible effort. But something about the past 4 minutes had rearranged something in him, and he needed 3 seconds with his back against a door to locate what it was. Vivian was standing by the window overlooking the south garden, her arms crossed, her posture the architecture of controlled fury. She was beautiful. She had always been beautiful. That had never been the question. "That woman needs to be let go," she said, without preamble. "No, Ethan." "No, Vivian. Sit down."
She didn't sit.
She turned from the window and looked at him with those sculpted features arranged into an expression he recognized, the one she deployed when she was prepared to negotiate her way back to what she wanted. He had once found it formidable. Tonight it looked like a technique. "A maid's child running loose through the house," she said, her voice controlled now, reasonable sounding. "I understand you have a soft spot for charity cases, but there are professional standards." She wasn't running loose. She came to her mother. He walked to his desk and sat on the edge of it, facing her. That little girl walked into her room and spread her arms in front of her mother because she could see her mother was upset. "She's 3 years old." Vivian's gaze cooled. It was inappropriate. It was love, he said. The word came out plainly, without decoration. Uncomplicated, unstrategic love. "I'm not sure I've seen a lot of that lately." A silence stretched between them. Something in it was not comfortable. He had been with Vivian for 2 years before the engagement. The engagement had been 4 months old, And in those 4 months, he had found himself conducting a private audit of their relationship with the same forensic attention he brought to his business ventures. What he found had troubled him. Not the findings themselves. There were good things there: compatibility on paper, shared social circles, mutual respect in the technical sense, but the fact that he needed to audit it at all. You shouldn't need to build a spreadsheet to determine whether you loved someone. His own parents had loved each other with a completeness that had made their small apartment feel larger than any mansion. His mother had worked 2 jobs while his father finished his engineering degree, and his father had worked nights when his mother got sick, and they had looked at each other across exhausted dinners with an expression he'd spent 33 years trying to find a word for. He'd never quite found it in English. The closest he got was witness, the sense of being completely, unconditionally seen.
He looked at Vivian now.
"Do you know her name?" he asked. A slight pause. "Whose name?" "The maid's." Another pause, longer. "I don't make it a point to."
"Clara," he said.
"Clara Mendez. She's been here 14 months. She starts at 5:30 every morning and she's done by 7 in the evening, and she goes to her daughter in the cottage and she does it again the next day. She arranges the flowers the way my mother used to, not symmetrically, the way the florist does, but with some variety in the heights, so they look like they grew that way. I noticed that 6 months ago, and I never said anything." Vivian was watching him with an expression that had shifted into something more wary. "She keeps the books on the 3rd shelf of the library in the order I prefer them," he continued, "which isn't alphabetical and isn't by genre, but by something I've never explained to anyone. She figured it out on her own. The kitchen staff told me once that she stays late on Fridays to make sure everything's exactly right for Saturday morning because she knows Saturday is when I work from home and I prefer order when I work." "Ethan." Vivian's voice had gone cautious. "What are you saying?" He wasn't entirely sure yet. He was the kind of man who understood his own mind with precision, who arrived at conclusions quickly and defended them with evidence. And yet tonight, he was assembling something whose shape he hadn't fully identified, like a structure seen only in parts through a fog. "I'm saying," he said slowly, "that a woman I've never properly acknowledged, who I walk past every morning and probably never once looked at directly, raised a daughter in difficult circumstances, alone, and that daughter has more courage and more human instinct at 3 years old than I have been bringing to this engagement." He looked at her steadily. "And I think we both know that." The quality of Vivian's silence changed.
"This is absurd," she said.
"Maybe," he agreed. "I've built 4 companies on impulses people called absurd. I trust the feeling. You're not seriously telling me that a toddler's theatrical little moment." "I'm telling you," he said quietly, "that I watched a child with no power in this house whatsoever stand between her mother and something that was hurting her. And I thought about whether I've ever done that for you. And then I thought about whether you've ever done it for me. And then I thought about what that means." He paused. "It means something, Vivian. It means something I can't negotiate away." The room was quiet for a long time. When Vivian left, 40 minutes later, the orchids in the hallway were still perfect and the table was still set for 2, and the duck was probably ruined in the kitchen, and Ethan Harrington stood at the window of his study looking out at the dark sweep of the south lawn, at the small warm light glowing in the cottage window at the property's edge, and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. The first, fragile stirring of a question that mattered. Clara did not sleep well. This was not unusual, strictly speaking. She was a light sleeper by nature and by necessity, the way most single mothers become light sleepers, ear always half-tuned to the frequency of a child's distress. But last night was different. Last night she lay in the narrow bed in the staff cottage with Rosie curled against her side, listening to her daughter breathe with the peaceful efficiency of someone with an uncomplicated conscience, and she stared at the ceiling and ran through every possible version of what today would bring. She had prepared herself, with the methodical pragmatism that had gotten her through the last 3 years, for the worst version. Termination. She would pack their things, there wasn't much, there was never much, and call her cousin Diane in New Jersey and ask if they could stay for a week while she found something new. She had savings. Not substantial ones, but enough for a deposit on a modest apartment. She had references from before the Harrington household, solid ones. She had skills and a work ethic that had never failed her. She and Rosie would be fine. She made herself believe this. She made herself believe it thoroughly, so that whatever happened this morning would find her standing upright. She rose at 5:15, made Rosie's favorite breakfast, scrambled eggs with tiny pieces of cheese, the way Rosie called them, confetti eggs. Watched her daughter eat with the focused enthusiasm of someone whose primary concerns were breakfast and Gerald's emotional well-being. Felt the familiar ache of complete love, the kind that is also its own species of grief, because you feel it most acutely precisely when you're most afraid. She brought Rosie to Mrs. Patton at 6. The older woman squeezed her hand and said nothing, which said everything. Clara began her rounds. The formal dining room first. The untouched dinner settings were still there. The food had been quietly cleared by kitchen staff, she gathered, but the china and crystal remained. She began removing them with care, and she was wrapping the orchid centerpiece to return to the cooler when she heard footsteps in the doorway. She looked up. Ethan was standing in the entrance to the dining room in a gray sweater and dark trousers, no jacket, no tie. The version of him she occasionally caught on Saturday mornings when he worked from home and moved through the house like a more human iteration of himself. He was holding 2 mugs of coffee. She blinked. "I made it myself," he said, with a quality in his voice she hadn't heard before, something careful and a little uncertain, like someone reading from a map they'd just hand-drawn. "The kitchen staff doesn't start for another half hour. I hope that's all right. I'm not sure how you take it." She stopped. "Reorganized. Black is fine." He crossed the room and set 1 mug on the edge of the table near her. Then he sat down in one of the dining chairs, just sat, in his own formal dining room, in a gray sweater, like a person, and wrapped both hands around his own mug. "Vivian won't be returning," he said. Clara said nothing. She stood very still and waited. "That's not because of anything that happened in the sitting room yesterday," he added. "Or not only because of that. I want to be accurate with you." He looked at the table for a moment, then back up. "The engagement was already. I had been." He paused in an uncharacteristic way, and she could see him assembling words with the unusual care of a man who is generally fluent, but had reached vocabulary that was harder to come by. "I had been avoiding an honest assessment of something for several months. Yesterday clarified it for me." "I'm sorry," Clara said, because she meant it, because ending an engagement was not nothing even when it was right. He looked at her. "Are you?" She considered. "I'm sorry you were in a situation that wasn't right for you. I'm not sorry it ended, if ending was right. That would be dishonest." Something shifted in his face. She saw it, a small, real thing like a window opening. "Mrs. Patton told me," he said, "that you've been here since 5:30 most mornings for 14 months. She told me you cried in the staff bathroom for the first 6 weeks because you felt guilty leaving your daughter, and then you made yourself stop because you decided guilt wasn't useful." He looked at her steadily. "Those were her words. She said you decided guilt wasn't useful." Clara felt the back of her throat tighten. "Mrs. Patton talks too much," she said softly. "Mrs. Patton loves you," he said simply. "She was telling me something she thought I needed to know." He paused. She was right. Clara picked up the coffee mug, held it with both hands the way people hold warm things when they need steadying. "What is it you needed to know?" she asked, though she wasn't sure she was ready for the answer. "That you're a real person," he said. That I've been living alongside a real person for over a year and treating you like furniture, and that your daughter, who is 3 years old and has apparently better instincts than I do, called me on it without even knowing that's what she was doing. He shook his head slightly. I owe you an apology.
I want to start with that.
Everything else can wait. Clara looked at him across the formal dining room with its removed orchids and its expensive empty chairs, and she thought about all the mornings she had moved through this house like a ghost, and she thought about Rosie spreading her arms wide, and she thought about the word witness, though she didn't know that was the word he'd been thinking of too. You don't have to, she started. I want to, he said. I've been learning that wanting to matters. It's different from having to. He held her gaze. Good morning, Clara.
I'm Ethan.
I live here, and I've been an oblivious idiot, and I make terrible coffee, and I'd very much like to start over. Clara Mendez stood in the morning quiet of that enormous house, and she laughed, a small, surprised, genuine sound, for the first time in a very long while.
Good morning, she said.
And the day began differently than she'd expected. November arrived and transformed the Connecticut hills into something almost unbearably beautiful, all amber and crimson, and the particular quality of light that comes only in the weeks before the world goes bare. Clara noticed beauty more acutely now, which she understood was a symptom of something, though she couldn't yet name it precisely enough to feel safe naming it. What had changed between her and Ethan was not dramatic in its mechanics. There was no sweeping gesture, no single moment of declaration. What changed was smaller and stranger and, she suspected, more durable, like the difference between a building assembled quickly and one whose foundation was poured to last. He started saying good morning. This was the first thing. He said it every day, unprompted, in the hallway or the kitchen or the library, and he said it the way you say it when you mean it rather than as social maintenance. He remembered that she took her coffee black, and occasionally there was a mug waiting for her in the kitchen, not always, not as a pattern she could depend on and therefore feel pressured by, just sometimes, the way kindness works best when it's neither obligatory nor calculated. He asked her, one afternoon in the second week of November, whether she had a background in flower arranging or whether the way she did the flowers was instinctive. She told him it was her grandmother's influence, a woman in El Paso who had grown things everywhere she could find soil, in window boxes and cracked urns and coffee tins on a fire escape, who had said that flowers arranged by human hands should try to remember that they used to grow wild. He had listened with a focused attention he apparently brought to everything and said, That's the most precise description of why I prefer them that way that I've ever heard, and your grandmother has never met me. Clara said, She would have liked you, actually. She had no patience for oblivious idiots either, but she had enormous patience for recovering ones. Ethan had laughed at that. A real laugh, unpolished, surprised out of him. These were the small things. But small things compounded daily become something else entirely. Rosie was the accelerant of everything. Children have no concept of gradual. They decide about people quickly, with the efficiency of someone who hasn't yet been taught to second-guess their instincts, and having decided, they proceed without caution. Rosie had decided about Ethan sometime around the second week, when he had appeared at the cottage door one evening holding a book, a picture book, specifically, one he had apparently purchased in town, a story about a small bear and a forest full of creatures who kept borrowing things from each other until they had to map where everything belonged. He had looked, standing at that door with his cashmere sweater and his picture book, slightly like a man who was surprised to find himself there, but had committed to it completely. Mrs. Patton mentioned Rosie likes bears, he said, by way of explanation. Clara had stepped aside to let him in. Rosie had sat on his left side on the small sofa, pressed against him with the uninhibited bodily comfort of a child who has decided on a person, and he had read the whole book twice without being asked to, doing different voices for different animals, and had spent 20 minutes afterward having a serious conversation with Gerald about whether elephants would prefer to live in forests or savannas, with Rosie providing Gerald's position in the debate and Ethan arguing the opposing view with what appeared to be genuine intellectual investment. Clara had stood in the kitchen doorway and watched, and felt something happen in the vicinity of her heart that she did not have immediate words for. She had not been looking for this. That was the thing she kept returning to. She had been so concentrated on the architecture of survival, the job, the housing, the childcare, the budget, the forward motion of getting through each week intact, that she had not had room in her thinking for anything else. She had not been hoping. She had not been watching for signs. She had been doing what she had trained herself to do, working, protecting her daughter, being sufficient. And then a child had spread her arms wide in a sitting room, and a man had come to a cottage door with a bare book, and something that Clara had carefully placed in a box labeled for another life. Maybe, someday had begun, quietly and without her permission, to unfold. She was frightened. She was also honest enough with herself to admit that fear and hope were not mutually exclusive, that the thing you're afraid of losing is always the thing worth being afraid of losing, because it means it matters. She told Mrs. Patton, who listened with the expression of someone hearing news they have been expecting for some time. "He's a good man," Mrs. Patton said. "I've known him since he was 25 and angry at the world and working himself to death, because he didn't know what else to do with himself. He's been waiting for something to matter more than the work." "I'm his employee," Clara said. "You're a person," Mrs. Patton replied, with gentle precision. "The employment is a detail. Details change." "Mrs. Patton, he asked me last week what your favorite meal was," the older woman said, her eyes bright. "I told him tamales, because you mentioned your grandmother's recipe once in November 2 years ago, and I paid attention. He asked me to write down everything I knew about the recipe." She patted Clara's hand. "He's been trying to learn to make tamales, Clara. A billionaire, in his own kitchen, at 11 o'clock at night. I found the evidence." Clara pressed both hands over her face. "Details change," Mrs. Patton repeated. On a Friday evening in the last week of November, Ethan knocked on the cottage door and presented 2 extremely imperfect tamales on a plate with the expression of someone submitting evidence in a case they knew was not fully proven. He said he was aware they were structurally compromised and possibly underseasoned, but that they had been made with significant effort, and he hoped that counted for something. Clara tasted one. It was, in fact, underseasoned. The masa was also slightly too thick. She told him this, honestly, while Rosie ate the second one with uncritical enthusiasm and declared it the best thing she had ever consumed. "Your daughter has better taste than you," he said. "My daughter once ate a crayon and then asked for another one," Clara replied. "I wouldn't rely on her as a benchmark." He laughed, and she laughed, and Rosie laughed because the adults were laughing, and outside the cottage window the November dark pressed gently against the glass, and the warm light held. December arrived with the first snow, not the tentative dusting of early winter but a real snowfall, 2 feet overnight, the kind that transforms a landscape so completely that you can almost believe the world has been newly made. Clara stood at the cottage window in the early morning and watched the grounds of the Harrington estate disappear under white, and Rosie pressed her nose to the glass and left a perfect small circle of fog that made her laugh at herself. Ethan called the household and told them to take the day. "Snow day," he said, which was something Mrs. Patton said he had never done in 14 years of owning the property. He appeared at the cottage at 9 with hot chocolate, properly made, with actual milk, not a packet, which he announced preemptively so that Clara would be aware he had been paying attention, and a sled he had apparently purchased at some point in the preceding weeks and stored in the garage on what Clara could only interpret as hopeful intent. They spent 3 hours on the hill at the back of the property. Rosie went down on the sled, shrieking with pure joy each time, and Ethan pulled it back up with the steady physical ease of a man who had started his life working construction summers to fund his first patent, who still had calluses on his hands under the quality clothes. Clara went down twice herself, laughing in a way that felt like something being unlocked. Ethan went down once, at Rosie's insistence, with Rosie in his lap, and the two of them arrived at the bottom in a snowbank with Gerald somewhere in the drift, and Rosie excavated the elephant with the urgency of a rescue operation while Ethan lay in the snow looking at the gray sky above him with an expression of complete, uncomplicated peace. Clara looked at him from the hillside and felt the word arrive. Finally, the one she'd been circling for weeks without finding. Not love yet, or not only love, the word that contained love but also held something larger. Home. He looked, lying in the snow with a 3-year-old excavating a stuffed elephant beside him, like someone who had found the place where the thing they'd been missing had been all along.
She didn't say it.
It wasn't time for saying things like that yet. But she felt it, with the solid certainty she trusted more than any words, the feeling of solid ground. They went inside after noon, and Mrs. Patton had materialized mysteriously to produce soup and bread with the efficiency of someone who had anticipated the whole day's arc perfectly, and they ate together in the kitchen, all of them at the same table, no hierarchy, no spatial politics, just people eating soup in a warm kitchen while a snowstorm finished itself outside. After Rosie fell asleep on the living room rug with Gerald tucked under her chin, exhausted by fresh air and joy, Ethan and Clara sat on the kitchen steps with tea, and the quiet of the snow was around them, and he looked at his mug for a moment and then at her. "I need to tell you something," he said. "I've been trying to find the right time." She waited. "I've been talking to my attorneys," he said, "about the estate staffing structure. About the cottage specifically." He paused, and she felt her chest tighten reflexively. Old reflex, survival reflex. And then he continued. "I want to formalize Rosie's right to be here. Not as the maid's child who's tolerated. As a resident.
Properly.
I want to put it in writing. The cottage is yours and hers for as long as you want it, separate from your employment. No conditions tied to the job. She should have a home that doesn't depend on your work performance or my moods or anyone else's opinion." Clara stared at him. "That's the start of it," he said. "That's the immediate thing, the practical thing. The other thing is harder to say without sounding like something from a movie, which I'm aware of, and I'd prefer not to sound like that, so I'm going to say it badly and plainly, and you can do what you like with it." He set down his mug and looked at her directly, the way he looked at things when he was certain about them. "I want to be in your life. Not your employer. Not the person in the big house who makes coffee sometimes and shows up with picture books. I want to be in your actual life, and in Rosie's life, and I want to deserve that, and I'm willing to spend whatever time it takes to deserve it." He paused. "I know the circumstances are strange. I know the power dynamic has been complicated, and I know trust is not a thing that arrives on a schedule. I'm not asking you to feel things you don't feel. I'm asking for the chance to try." The snow outside had stopped. The world was completely quiet, covered over and clean. Clara thought about a woman in El Paso who grew flowers in coffee tins and said they should try to remember they used to grow wild. She thought about 3 years of forward motion, of making herself sufficient, of choosing practical over hopeful. She thought about a little girl with wild curls and a stuffed elephant who had walked into a room and spread her arms wide, whose instincts had outpaced every adult in that space. She thought about the way a window looks when it opens. Rosie already thinks you're hers, she said quietly. You should know that. She told Mrs. Patton that Ethan is our person. In those words, our person. She looked at him. She's 3 years old, and she already decided. He was very still. What about you? Clara Mendez, 28 years old, strong, careful, made of honest things, reached across the step and placed her hand over his. I think, she said slowly, that my daughter has better instincts than I've been giving myself credit for, and that I've been so busy making myself enough that I forgot I'm also allowed to want things. She felt his hand turn under hers, his fingers closing gently around her hand. So yes.
Try.
Well, try. He didn't say anything immediately. He just held her hand in the quiet of the Snowden morning, and after a moment she rested her head against his shoulder, and they sat like that on the kitchen steps while their tea went cold, and Rosie slept inside with Gerald tucked close, dreaming the untroubled dreams of a child who has decided the world is fundamentally good and seen nothing yet to sufficiently challenge this assessment. 3 weeks later, on the day after Christmas, Ethan announced to his board of directors that he would be transitioning certain operational duties to his COO because he intended to be home at a reasonable hour and he intended to be present in a life that had recently revealed itself to contain things worth being present for. His COO, who had been waiting 5 years for exactly this development, celebrated privately and professionally. Mrs. Patton received a Christmas bonus of such generosity that she sat down at the kitchen table and held the envelope for a long time before opening it, and when she did, she called her sister in Vermont and said simply, "He finally figured it out." In the cottage at the edge of the property, there was a small Christmas tree that Rosie had decorated with absolute creative freedom, which meant it was maximally chaotic and completely perfect. Underneath it were 3 stockings hung on the windowsill, small, medium, and large, because Rosie had insisted, with the authority of someone legislating reality, and authority like that should not be questioned. Gerald had a stocking too. He had insisted also. Outside, the Connecticut hills were white and still and beautiful, and inside the small cottage, the warm light held through the evening and into the night, held against the cold and the quiet, held the way good things hold when you stop waiting for them to be taken away and simply, finally, let yourself keep them. And Clara Mendez, who had once learned to move through a mansion like a ghost, sat in her own kitchen in her own home with her daughter asleep across her lap and a man beside her who was learning the names of all her grandmother's spices, and she felt solid, real, unhurried. Scene.
The end.